North Carolina. Here, I'll start this way. A lot of this work is, or all of this work is autobiographical, and it's really based on the question you just asked me, where it came from. So in that way, it's interesting because I just started working this way in about 2016, about 30 years into a sculpture making career, so this is really at the tail end of that, right? And I never felt comfortable expressing my personal story in my work before that. So how that came about was for years, I'm a professor, associate professor at West Virginia University. I've been teaching there for 16 years. I have been giving an assignment there that I ended up doing myself, I guess is a good way to put it. I started doing this assignment. How many people are familiar with the podcast or the NPR radio show, The Moth?
Oh, yeah.
It's a storytelling show.
Yeah.
So I love that show, right? Real stories by real people. So I gave an assignment to my students that they have to write a short story. This is a sculpture class. They have to write a short story about an experience that they have had, an experience that they feel is like life-changing or motivating or funny or just something that happens. Sometimes they're very mundane. So it's a semester-long assignment. They have 3 months to do it. They get the assignment on the first day of class, and it's due on the last day of class. So by midterm, they have to write this story and present it to the class. And the first few years I gave it, they were, assignments get better the more you give them, and the more you see, the more you can steer people towards better outcomes. But anyway, watching these students really kind of bare their souls eventually about their work and then make these pieces about that experience. And the kind of through line of the assignment is that the work should be about the story, but it does not tell the story. It's not the work's job to tell this story. The point of the story is to be inspired. And then what you take from that, what you make from that, becomes the work. But it is in no way the work's job. The work should stand alone, separate from the story. So one thing we do with the students is we read these stories and we try and identify different signifiers and symbols and things that they're using in that story, things that stand out, and then how those can be made into a more, potentially abstracted piece of art, not necessarily narrative piece of art. So while all of this work I feel is autobiographical, I don't feel any of the work is narrative. So while it all comes from my experiences, I'm not trying to pass on those particular experiences. And in fact, within the body of work, it becomes kind of obscured except for one particular piece that is actually about one particular thing. So that's kind of the basis of the work. So, autobiographically, I was born in North Carolina, from first to, we'll say, radical hippie parents. One that really continued on with that, one that kind of backed away and moved to suburbia after they separated, but we'll get there. So I was, the first 5 years of my life spent on a commune as the only child amongst a bunch of adults who probably were not really responsible enough to be raising a child of any kind. Some of them basically teenagers like my mother at the time. And obviously a lot of that, it was all before I was 5 years old. Then my parents separated when I was 5 under dubious conditions. Eventually my father ended up in prison, not for anything related to the divorce, actually for something related to that is now legal in this state. So when they separated, my mother and I moved to suburban Ohio, moved to a cul-de-sac, Haverhill Hill Drive in Twinsburg, Ohio. And I think that's where, this is the first piece in the series, and that's really where this came from, was that radical change of location from really literally living in dirt floors and a van as a kid to living in this white, pristine, giant house full of people, full of people who were all related to each other by blood, not by common interest, which is what I had grown up with prior to that. So to say it was a culture shock is understated. This is also 1975. I'm a third generation atheist, so moving into Ohio suburbia at the time, that was not and being the son of a divorced parents, that wasn't something common in 1975 and 76. So already feeling kind of out of place within the suburban environment, that pushed me farther out of place. I never really felt like I fit in. And coming back and reflecting on it through my work, I mean, that's what a lot of this work is about, is this idea of the perceived safety and community of suburbia that is, in my opinion, more of a social construct than a reality. If you don't fit the exact puzzle piece of that particular place you may be, you're an outlier and treated as such. And I'll leave it at that. But certainly those experiences led me to more countercultural aptitudes, or being more attracted to things that were the outliers, especially since my parents were very much outliers. I'll talk a little bit more about my dad when we get into the room. And then fast forward, we continued to live in suburbia, whatnot, grew up, went through a couple stepfathers. And as a teenager, I always felt out of place. I had real issues fitting in. And the best thing that ever happened was as a teenager, we moved from this one town where I was, again, the son of a single parent waitress. We were not by any means affluent people. But we lived in a very affluent town, so again, we did not, and my mother made that decision for the schools, and that's great, I could learn a lot, but not necessarily fit me, right? So I never felt a part of that community. So the best thing that ever happened to me was we moved when I was in high school, got away from all my childhood persecutors, and found a new place. And I also found skateboarding and punk rock at that very same time. And that, to me, and it does choke me up, was the first time I had community, right? First time I had people that felt the same way as me, people that were also outliers, and the fact that we all came from different places, because where we all came together was on the streets of Akron, Ohio. We didn't all go to school together, we didn't know each other, we didn't live in the same neighborhoods. We found each other through skateboarding and through this horrible music that we all loved. And going to shows that we were in no way old enough to get into, and consuming community means a lot to me. So that's what this work is kind of about. And I know it has this real kind of saccharine look, and it has this real kind of perfected and manufactured feel, and that's very purposeful. There's one thing that also happened in the 80s, so now we're in the 80s, was that the rest of the world also started to discover skateboarding and punk rock. And that started to be the same thing that happened with the hippie movement, the same thing that happened with the beat movement, the same thing that's happened with every counterculture movement ever. It started to become modified by mass culture, by popular culture. And what they did was they took it from us and repackaged it and painted it pink and yellow and green and sold it back to us at much higher prices, right? And it was and a lot of us really felt like that was something that was being taken from us. Like that was ours, right? And that really became driven home with the music. Then later in the 90s, with the popularity of quote-unquote underground music like Nirvana or whatever, which I would not, well, that's a whole different story. A lot of other bands deserved a lot more than them. Anyway, that idea of your culture being sold, like something you worked so hard for being taken away from you and sold back to you, and repackaged and made like nice and easy to understand for the masses, right? So again, those are like the kind of underliers of all this work. Other things that I took from that punk rock community was the idea that no one's going to do it for you and you have to be able to do it for yourself. DIY came from the punk rock community, in my opinion, that idea of do it yourself. Like we were teenagers and we were putting out records and putting on concerts and forming bands and forming communities. Like I remember when we had to figure out we were going to print our first LP and we were doing it all ourselves, right? We didn't know how to make an album cover, so we took an old album out of somebody's parents' record collection and tore it apart and looked at how it was made and traced it. And then made our own templates, and cut our own album covers, and learned how to fold them and all that. So again, like this idea that no one's coming to help, so you got to do it yourself. So in that vein, my sculpture is very much that. Everything you see here, I made from scratch, including like parts like this. This is something that I made a wooden positive of, then made a silicone mold of, and then cast in plastic, and then painted. But it's supposed to look like something you could just go buy at Home Depot. But everything here is hand fabricated. Everything except this piece is hand painted. This is the one piece I actually had enough money to have powder coated. But everything else is hand painted to mimic what I had to do. So again, it's like, wow, that was way too expensive. How can I do it myself in my garage, where I do everything? So that idea of I want things to look manufactured because I want to trick you into thinking that this is something that, like I get that a lot. Like, oh, well, where did you get this? Where did you get that? It's like, well, I got the raw steel at the steel supply. I got the raw porcelain from the ceramic supply. These are plywood. These are cast porcelain. These are all welded steel. So same elements at play there with the other cast plastic elements. So I'm lifelong learner. I definitely feel that that's a big part of my process. I'm always trying to learn new things and new ways of doing things. I had never slip cast porcelain before I did, or slip cast anything for that matter, before I made these houses. I have been working as a welding fabricator for quite some time. So these pieces, this piece is the first one of all of this work. This is the oldest piece. It actually had been retired, but then was requested to be in the show. And how can I say no once I saw the space, because I thought it looked incredible in here. So this may be its last show. We'll see. This is where it all started. So this is, again, kind of an outlier piece in that it's not named and thought about. So this piece is way to all the other work. So this space is just simply called cul-de-sac. It's kind of about that culture shock of moving into suburbia from the commune, right? So then these, and the rest of the pieces in the series derive their names from music, from song titles. So these pieces are all collectively titled Respectable Street, which was a song, or is a song by an English band called XTC. And it's very much about a lot of things I was saying, about the veneer of suburbia and keeping up with Joneses, keeping up appearances, but the reality of what's going on behind all those closed doors, that it isn't, life is not perfect, and that it's all falling apart all the time. Not to be cynical, but I am. So these pieces are kind of about that, and where the structures are derived from. There's some subtle things in here, like these cutaway sections are meant to mimic the transitions of a skateboard ramp, half pipe, which you may be familiar with. And then, there are these suburban lawns, which is where a lot of the punk rock didn't necessarily start in cities. It started in suburbia and moved to the cities. We all congregated in the cities, but really, I grew up around Cleveland and Akron, and everybody that was part of the scene was not necessarily from Cleveland or Akron. That's just where the shows were. Everybody was from the suburbs, right? We were all coming in. And the people that actually lived in the cities were not necessarily, there's a different thing going on there. I've done a lot of reading on this as an academic. I've done a lot of actual hard study of these things. And a lot of the mythology around it will reinforce that. Even in, this was a case where New York City was behind other people in a way, where it came to New York from other places and certainly flourished once everybody gets together in one place. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard from Wayne White, who may be familiar with Wayne White. He made all the sets for Pee Wee Herman show, but he is also a brilliant painter. I got to see him speak at a conference, and he told all the young people there, find out what you want to do, find out where they're doing it, and go there. Don't wait for it to come to you. I was like, man, I wish somebody would told me that. So that's where these structures are derived from. The actual steel elements are meant to literally be infrastructure, meant to be the thing that binds it all together. And it's also referring to like handrails and architecture and the things that skateboarders used when we didn't have skate parks. Because when I was skateboarding, it was out of fad again. So they just tore it down, all the skate parks from the 70s. Nobody was building any new ones until the late 90s. So we took to the streets, and that's when it became, skateboarding became synonymous with like vandalism and hoodlum culture and all that, which we certainly embraced. But, you know, I mean, when you get told you're a criminal enough, you know, you just start to believe it, whether it's true or not. We're just kids, right? In fact, some of the best experience I've had with law enforcement, and I've had some negative ones too, have been them rolling up on us skateboarding in some abandoned parking lot and going, oh, you're just skateboarding, have fun and drive away. You know, I've had the opposite experience too, and those are the best ones. They realize we're just a bunch of kids in there doing their car. So now I think we can move into the other room. Yeah. Structures and themes. But this is the newer word. I didn't necessarily mean to split these up chronologically. That's how it worked out. Where I'm trying to be a little more obscure with my references. I'm not, there aren't any more little pink houses, right? And yes, that is a tongue-in-cheek reference to John Cougar's vision of the suburban life. Not that I'm a big John Cougar fan, but the little pink house thing was just like hammered into us as, you know, when I was a teenager. So, and then there's also the folk song of the little boxes, folk song, you know, regained popularity recently, but I think it refers to as well. But when I was thinking about what color to paint those houses, just I could not think of any color other than pink. In the newer work that's being made now, if you check out my Instagram, if you're an Instagrammer, Jamie Sculpture, the houses are now upside down. And they're taking on different forms, they're losing a lot more references and just becoming shapes. Another thing that happened right before I started making this work was I was lucky enough to see an exhibition which we had at our own school by a sculptor named Richard Bezak, who the way he dealt with narrative and his abstracted forms really, again, like in the same way seeing my students work through these things, seeing that artist who's a much more accomplished artist than I, deal with these same ideas. It really changed my ideas about how I wanted to make art. Because prior to all of this, and you can see it on my website at jamesculpture.com, I made a lot of very formal work that was in no way autobiographical. A lot of it, I worked for about 8 years on a series of these light box pieces that combine photography with fabrication, steel and light and electricity, made kinetic work. The lightbox pieces were, to me, while I am certainly environmentally minded, the work itself was kind of poking fun at environmentalism. It was recontextualizing environmental ideas in a very packaged and plastic way, which kind of led to this kind of work. In retrospect, the work was saying the same thing, it's just in a different way. This is much more direct. Anyway, so we see some of the same structures again. These are leaning a little harder into the skateboarding aspect of things. In fact, these forms right here, and then you've seen that piece as well, are derived from parking blocks. You know, and that's what we call a parking block. In a parking lot, which is prime skateboarding architecture. Actually, where were we the other day? Crystal Lake. They have benches all around the lake at the beach where we were at, and they all had little bolted on pieces of steel that would keep people from skateboarding on. And I wanted to take pictures just to show this, look, they're still trying to stop us from skateboarding. And you see that stuff everywhere. And some of these things refer to that, like things that have been added on to prevent use. And certainly I understand it does damage, but. So this piece is called Mad Garden, which is again a song title from the band JFA, which JFA stands for Jodie Foster's Army. Isn't funny. But as you'll notice, you'll notice there's a wood grain pattern in it. What this is it's built out of pulpwood press board that you would see in like a cabin or something. And then I went in and all the seams and hand carved the transitions between the two out of Bondo, so it all seems like a solid thing. It's actually hollow, I pick it up with one hand practically, but it looks very heavy. But that's just for me. I mean, the fact that it is light and looks heavy is really just for my own edification. But now I'm telling you guys. Same with those are hollow and super light. And derived from the same, those are clean air, obviously, but derived from the same starting point, right? The parking lot. The piece on the wall there. And that piece is also a JFA song title, which is blatant localism. Meaning, and that really talks about the kind of territorialism of the time, but also the common culture of what punk rock was. So I spent a few years, we'll say, as a transient, homeless, living in my van, whatever you want to call it. And everywhere I went, traveling around the country, and I traveled really extensively around the country during that time, I met other people, like-minded people. And at this point, I was, in my late 20s, approaching my 30s. So it wasn't like I was a teenager anymore. And this idea, like meeting people that have a common experience, but did not experience it in the same place or way that you did, but you all share this common idea, makes for, again, like really fast friends. And that group of people I talk about being part of the scene with from Ohio, that group of friends has now expanded to like literally hundreds of people that I know around the country that had those same experiences in different places around the country. And then I moved to Morgantown, West Virginia, and started teaching there. They have a very vibrant and old, like their underground, like punk rock underground music scene is like famous from the 80s. The bar that all the bands played at is still open in Morgantown, which isn't the case in a lot of cities. Certainly not the ones I came from. So that was one of the reasons I chose to, I had multiple job offers, and that was one of the main reasons I chose, back to two sushi restaurants, chose to go to Morgantown. So it still factors in really heavily into how I see my life and how I approach things. That, again, the DIY, everything springs from that, right? There's a statement, it's a quote, but I don't know who said it, right? It's an uncredited quote. I saw it somewhere years ago, and it's really struck home. I've kind of taken it since I don't know who said it, and I say it so much, a lot of people think I made it up now, which I'm fine with. But it is, if you used to be punk rock, you never were. There's a lot of people that say that were something. The people I know are something. Like, it irrevocably changed my life for the better. A lot of people don't have friends like that. A lot of people don't have friends that they've had for 30 or 40 years. That even today, something we all come together to help each other. I mean, it would be great for a healthcare system came together to help each other, but we all do it since it won't, right? It's really sad now, but I can't think of how many GoFundMe's I've contributed to or sold art for to try to keep something alive. Anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Anyway, moving on to this piece. This again is kind of about the suburban experience. This is the title comes from Operation Ivy song, which is Room Without a Window. And again, to me, it speaks to isolation, but it also speaks to this kind of common experience that I and others that shared this experience had. This is the first piece I started casting rubber in, and I really like that. It shows up a lot more in my work. So these pink elements are what's called dragon skin rubber. From the movie industry. That's what it started. It's what a lot of your movie prosthetics and stuff are made out of. I use it for much more rudimentary purposes, but it still works great. And to me, a lot of times I would pick a color that things are, and it just stays that way. So to me, rubber is pink. And I'm waiting to see if I ever cast anything in rubber that isn't pink. I'm about to make a piece right now that I'll be casting 5 gallons of rubber into. It's about $1,000 worth of this stuff. Just put that in context. Because I got a grant That's why. And I just love the material, the flexibility of it, again, the kind of otherworldly feel of it that it feels like it refers to so many other things. Like here, I'm using it in a way to refer to the chunks of wax we always carry around in our pockets to wax those curves so we can slide on them better than a skateboard. That would also on a hot day melt in your pocket. I guess that brings us to this piece, which is the outlier among all these things. So I had mentioned earlier about my father going to prison in the 70s for marijuana possession, whatever you would say. It wasn't very offense, mind you. But still, 2.5 years for a quarter ounce of marijuana seems extreme. Anyway, when he was in prison, he got the idea that when he got out, he didn't ever want to have a job again, which I so admire him for. And the plan he came up with to achieve that was he was going to stand out in front of supermarkets in a gorilla suit with balloons and waving cars and get paid to do that. And that's what he did. He got out of prison, he went and bought a gorilla suit, he started doing that. And luckily for him, this man, luckily for him, he met his second wife, who was this amazing person. And he also met a man named Whip Bannon, who basically saw him out doing this thing and was like, I like the cut of your jib, son. And decided to take him under his arm and teach him like the ropes of old vaudeville. And literally taught him how to be a bullwhip artist. So Whip Bannon was the bullwhip artist who taught Harrison Ford how to throw the bullwhip for the first Indiana Jones movie. He also taught my dad. At one point, my dad was one of 6 people in the world that could do the things that he did with a bullwhip, which is pretty amazing. In and of itself, like put out a lit cigarette at 16 feet, can't even ride a bullwhip. That his very trusting, maybe naive wife would be holding. And then that grew to a circus. He actually started his own traveling vaudevillian circus that he basically ran from 1979 until that wife left him in 1986 or 7. And what it was his wife, Jane, was Lady Jane, the woman of steel. She would walk on the broken glass and potholes and lay on the bed of nails. And he was the bullwhip artist. And they traveled the back roads of America, was what he called it. They didn't. The neat thing about what they did was called the Rainbow Traveling Show. Their moniker was internationally unknown and totally unfamous. And one day I would use that for a show title. What they would do, and it's really neat, all their shows were free to the people that would go see it. They would travel, roll into some small town, and my dad would make, I'll just say right now, there's more sordid ways to go through all this. But anyway, my dad would basically go to one business and say, if you chip in X amount, and the guy over here at the hardware store does, and the person over here at the grocery store does, then we can put on a show in the park for free to the public and create an event around it. And he would make that happen in town after town after town after town. And then after doing that for a couple of years, that became a circuit. And they expected him to come back through every year. I did 2 years in a row, did Super Circus Sailing Sale Days, and God knows where the hell we were. But so while I was growing up in suburbia with my mom, I was spending the occasional summer when my father could afford to get me in the circus, right? There's pictures of me driving 10 stakes at 9 years old. I'm just for the photo op, I don't think I did. But, it was a very hard life. It was very hand to mouth. We called it rice beans and gasoline. Was the things that you needed. So this piece is about that. Later on, so after his second wife left him, he ended up in Renaissance fairs, which is where he spent the rest of his life performing. And I spent a couple years traveling with him, both in the circus and doing the Renaissance fairs throughout my life. And this piece is about that, to me. It's about that, the transient nature of doing that. It's about how everything has to pack up and move. Only being in a place for a few days at a time. In fact, when he started doing Renaissance fairs, he called it retirement. his Renaissance fair lasted for like 2 months. We were in one place for 2 months. He'd never been in one place. He hadn't been in one place for 2 months for a decade. You know, up until he finally built a house in the early 2000s, he had not slept overnight in a bed in a house since like 1978. He just lived in his vehicles that he built himself out of old U-Hauls, little buses, like all that stuff, all those trains you see now, you know, the microbuses and people living in those things. Well, he was one of the forefathers of that stuff. Before that was ever a thing, he was just a weirdo driving around and painted up U-Hauls. A bunch of monkeys. Yes, he had a bunch of monkeys. Yeah, he had a small circus, like petting zoo thing. So when they couldn't sell the whole circus act, they'd go to kindergartens and do a petting zoo thing. So they had that going. They had a lot of different ways to make small amounts of money. So again, this is about that. My father and I, I've spoken pretty reverently about it, but my father and I did not have the best relationship. And the man capable of doing kinds of things that he did to stay alive isn't necessarily, you know, he's an awesome eccentric, and he created these magical memories for many people, but that did not make him a good husband or father in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I can't say he didn't try, but his efforts were sometimes very lacking, as all three of his ex-wives would attest. But this piece is about that. The funny thing about this one to me is, you know, whenever I'm installing this piece, if someone's helping me or I was wondering when we're going to unpack this part of it, I'm like, oh, no, that's it. It's done. You know, the shape is meant to be like chaotic and uncomfortable. There's meant to be this kind of uncomfortable space or dialogue between the two elements. I'm not sure if that means one is me and one is him. I really don't know. I know a lot of people would say the same things about me that I say about him, although I have managed to maintain my marriage 16 years today. Thank you very much. So yeah, that's it. Any questions? Yeah.
Obviously, we're different generations, okay?
Sure.
And everyone's life is really accumulation of their experiences. Now, I share with you the love of color. The wife and I both do art, okay? And the love of materials, okay? You've taken more or less common materials and you've done a great job of personal expression with those. And you've gone through the process of creating things that normally wouldn't exist. You're
We always say artists make things that nobody wants, or nobody thinks they want.
It's a good presentation of your thought pattern and your experiences, okay?
Thank you.
And it's kind of interesting when I see your foundations, for instance. I think of the space program, Moonlander, et cetera, okay? In your skateboarding experience, I can see with the metalworkings and your presentation of suburbia. Yeah. Okay, we live in a condo situation, so
we look like that.
Okay. But both of our beginnings were relatively poor and basically sub-quality housing, all right, and kind of a hand-to-mouth existence. We weren't transitional like you, but we had the experiences of not being in the top echelon, okay,
Sure.
society, all right? So it's just some of my comments in your presentation.
Awesome, well thank you. I'm glad you noticed a couple things there. So transformation of material is a huge thing for me. Like I want to take, in fact, it was a big deal for me to start using this rubber because that is an art material, right? That's not really used in everything else here you can find in this building, right? You got it built out of this. So that's a big part of it for me is taking everyday things and trying to do something else with them, you know. So I'm glad you noticed that. And funnily enough, so yes, the space program, right? And I grew up, I was born in 1969, so like right at the start of the space race, watched those people in the Challenger explode on TV in a classroom. You know, that is very formative. experience to me. I never saw that in this work. And it's there, I mean, it is in every one of these pieces, right? Somebody pointed that out to me a few years ago, and I was like, whoa, and I don't feel comfortable saying that because I've been thinking about it when I made it, but it's there, it is absolutely there. Also, oddly enough, so these stanchions, while they make it very easy to set these things up and level them wherever I put them, even on the wonkiest floors. Also, so my dad's first circus truck had a stage that folded out at the back of it, and then the back of the truck became the proscenium. This is the mechanism he used to make leveling feet. So that is, I remember setting that stage up over and over again as a kid, and that has always stuck with me. So that, to me, that's where it came from. It's from his circus BX. I mean, obviously there's always things at play that you don't see, right?
This is Traverse City happening.
This is the high rises, right?
Yes, yes. It's a shame, but that's what's happening.
Your colors too, I think, are interesting.
They're so
Kind
bold.
Bold, contrasting as well, and they definitely catch your attention.
Color was a big step for me in my older work. I was definitely a truth to materials person. Steel was steel, wood was wood. Little painting here and there. I might spray paint or paint the steel black, but beyond that, I wasn't willing to go or polish it silver. So this level of transformation with paint and whatnot, it was a big step for me. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed that as well. These colors actually were the colors from his service, yellow and or green and orange were the Rainbow Traveling Show colors, which I wasn't even thinking about when I made this piece, and one of my uncles pointed out to me. He was like, you're using the RTS colors. So again, things happen. I'm a big believer in intuition, and as an academic, we have to downplay that with our students. But as soon as I get them away from everybody else, that's all bullshit. It's what comes up here first, and then you just figure out what to say about it. And I tell my grad students all the time, especially when they're writing their thesis, I'm like, this is the last time you ever have to do this, so just do it, get it over with, and you go out and make art about whatever you want. Any other questions?
So how do you, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have a question on the circular suburbia.
Mm-hmm.
You have no doors or windows on the buildings. Is there a statement there?
I'm not sure.
You are the ticky-tacky era.
Right. So good, I'm glad you know that. So awesome. I'm not necessarily trying to be, there's not a necessarily message there, but there's a few things I was thinking about when I was making it. One, that feeling of isolation or being trapped, right? So no windows, no doors, right? But also the idea of a game piece, right? My father made games, and I made games. In fact, I'm working on publishing a game right now. So that's part of it too, and the idea, that they feel movable and replaceable and manufactured and mass-produced. So yes, and that was very purposeful, that I didn't put little windows, I didn't put, my one uncle in North Carolina said they look like tobacco barns. It's like, how much for them to paint tobacco barns, he would say. I'd say, they're not tobacco. But that's fine, he sees that too, right? Yeah. So that's interesting to me as well. But yeah, to me, isolation, lack of options, things like that. My grandfather, to this day, and I'm so happy he's still alive to say it, but can't get through a time together with me without saying at least once, oh, I'm always surprised at how well it worked out for you, given your background. Thanks, Grandpa. So, not a lot was, there weren't a lot of, I think there was a benefit to not having a lot of expectations put upon you also. So everything I do is an accomplishment, I guess. But certainly nobody, friends and family included, ever thought I'd be a tenured college professor, that's for sure. Me amongst them. But as soon as I saw how little my professors worked when I was in college, they got their summers off and stuff, I'm like, that's what I want to do. Because that was my dad, right? I never want to work again. So to me, whenever anybody asks me how's my job, I say, it beats working. You know, I mean, to me, teaching art is, and I'm not a fan of that statement, you know, make what you love your work and you'll never work another. No, it's like make what you love your work and you'll end up hating what you love. That's what I think. But if I can find that happy balance between the two, which I feel I have, because I love being an educator and I love working with young people, I think it helps keep me young at the same time, or at least somewhat in tune, or now aware of how out of touch I am. And it doesn't necessarily feel like work until I have to do all the paperwork. I always say, I'm living the dream, but I didn't realize the dream had so much paperwork involved.
How do your pieces start? Do you have an idea and you start sketching? I feel like you might be tinkering with little parts and just, how do your pieces get started?
So, I like to say, and I'd say it's 90% true, that I start with a pretty precise plan, and then I make, especially if my work prior to this work, was drawn out exactly how it would end up done, except for minor things that change in construction, but I see it completed in my head. So like I see something like that in my head for whatever reason, and then I make it. So now that I'm now working with newer work, which is different than all of this stuff, people have accused me of being a painter, really mad at me. It's a lot more of an intuitive process. I'm using chance operations. So setting up parameters, but then letting whatever happens within those parameters, which is not anything I would have ever been comfortable with before. I'm a control freak, for sure. You know, I did that from both of my parents. But now I'm relaxing a little bit, and honestly, it's come from teaching and come from us, you know, because a lot of times I give my students assignments that are not things I would necessarily do, but then I see them do it, and I'm like, oh. I tell my grad students all the time, like, don't worry, I won't steal any of your ideas till you get out of school for 4 years. And then I'll let them know when I'm taking them. But it's hard not to be influenced, right?
Yeah.
We're an amalgam of all our experiences. So I've seen students do things that certainly have influenced my work, absolutely, and hopefully the other way as well. I can't remember the question.
No, I think, I was just asking your process, but you explained that.
So these are all pretty meticulously planned and ended up how I planned them. To make things like this work and all fit together, it can't be just sitting around with a pile of, you know, I have fellow artists that are much more their studio is a total wreck, and they just pick stuff up off the floor and make art out of it. I'm not that way. My studio is very clean. Everything is where it belongs because I'm a little scatterbrained, so if I don't put something back immediately, then it's just gone. So yeah, a lot of my process has been like dealing with my flighty brain. I'm sure that, you know, when I was hyperactive in the 70s, I'm sure I had ADHD or whatever. So that's really me fighting against my own natural tendencies is a big part of how I make my work. Because naturally, I'm pretty not organized I think at the core of myself, so I've had to force myself over the years to be a very organized person. Otherwise, it all falls apart very quickly. But again, in my new work, it's much more playful. The outcomes are more playful in a lot of cases. I'm still using a lot of the same ideas. Counterculture stuff. Some of the new work is based on like heavy metal, like underground heavy metal culture, like death metal music, as they would call it. I don't know if you guys might not be familiar with the trope, but heavy metal bands, or a certain genre of heavy metal band, like having a logo that was totally illegible. They can't read it all. I love that. They look like Rorschach tests. They look like ink blots. So I've started taking those and stacking them and making what basically look like Rothko Colorfield paintings out of these heavy metal logos. So that's what the new work is. I haven't shown it all together yet. I'm working on a huge 100 print. I'm doing an edition of 100 prints with artist image resource in Pittsburgh. They're a professional press, and that's what it is. We're stacking these, like printing these logos on top and on top and top of each other, and they make these like gorgeous abstracted forms.
Oh my gosh.
And that's been a big step for me too. Like I have not done any of the physical work. Like I prepared the plates and got all the stuff ready, but then I ship it off to them and they do all the printing, and that's real weird for me too, to not have my hand in every aspect of things. So that's been an interesting. I got a grant to do that too, so that was excellent. So yeah, so the newer work is a little more playful. A little more accessible, maybe, as far as, maybe not in subject matter, but as far as the way they actually look. And I'm doing work with quotes, too. So a couple of Kurt Vonnegut quotes I've been working with. People who I feel were big, like I'm a voracious readers or authors that I feel were big influences on me. So I've started with Vonnegut and Bukowski, but there will be more. And then I'm also doing, believe it or not, as a 52-year-old man saying that I'm making art with song lyrics in it, which is something I tell my students never to do. I'm doing it. So that's fun. And they're all songs that were I listened to when I was a teenager.
Yeah.
I'm definitely one of those people who's guilty of